We're going to move into our A-frame install. This is the main structure of the build. So these are powder-coated steel pieces that are going to be installed right to the ribs of the van. This is what our L-track is going to bolt into, and subsequently all of your like beds and bags and other components. This is the true strength that makes the Adventure Wagon kit so great. You'll have three main sections of parts for the A-frame. You're going to have your verticals, which are pieces 1 through 4, S1 through S4. And then you're going to have your horizontals, which are pieces S5 through S10. And then you'll have your wire chase pieces, which are S11 through S13. For this part of the install, you're going to need a number of different tools. So you're going to need a riv nut and a rivet setter. So the riv nut is going to need to be M6 compatible. We do strongly recommend that you use a pneumatic tool here. Using a hand setter for this many like attachment points gets really hard on your hands. So if you can get a pneumatic one, strongly recommended. You'll need a 3/16 rivet setter. Again, recommended to use a pneumatic or battery powered option here. All the rivets in the system are stainless steel, so they're a little bit like burlier, harder to set. So using a hand setter is pretty tough for those. So yeah, they have pneumatic and battery powered ones that you can choose from. You're also going to need a drill, your 3/16 and 25/64 drill bits, which came in your first box. And then you're also going to need a impact driver, and then your hardware. So your hardware, you're going to need your 3/16 rivets and then your rivet nuts. And then we do recommend clamps or tape or other kind of whatever works best for you to hold the pieces in place while you mount them. We use a mixture of clamps and tape in this video. You can also use magnets if you have them on hand. Just be careful not to scratch the sheet metal of the van or the A-frame because it can cause rust down the line. You'll also need your rust prevent and little brush that comes in your first box, and a deburring tool to clean up the holes that we'll drill. Here we're going to point out the different sections of the A-frame and where they live in the van. You can use this as a guide as you're moving through your install and reference point for where your pieces will end up. We're going to start with our S1 piece. This is your vertical. This is your most important mounting point because all the other pieces are going to branch off of this. We're going to line this up with a factory hole on that, like kind of where that vertical and horizontal rib meet. There's a little plastic indexing point on that piece that's going to pop into that hole. You don't need to drill it out or anything like that. It's sized to fit snugly into that factory hole there. And then we're going to line this piece up with the zero line of the van. So the zero line is that seam that runs down the length of the van vertically. After you have your S1 piece lined up with the zero line, we're going to secure it in place with some set screws. This is going to be the same process for all of our A-frame pieces. We're going to get it lined up in place based on the indexing points, secure it with set screws, just to make sure everything's lined up nicely. And then we're going to move on to drilling our holes for our riv nuts and rivets. Once we're sure that everything's in the right spot, we don't need to shift it all. When you're drilling the set screws, there's going to be pre-drilled holes in the A-frame pieces. That's going to allow you to have like a guidance point, and then you don't have to drill through the A-frame itself. You're only drilling into the van. After you have your S1 piece secured in place with the set screws, we're going to move on to S2. This is going to be your aft driver's side vertical piece. This again has one of those little plastic indexing points, just like S1, that's going to go into a factory hole where that vertical and upper horizontal rib meet. This piece, the bottom of it can kind of go back and forth depending on your specific van. So we just clamp it in place at the bottom instead of using a set screw at this point. And we're going to use our horizontal A-frame pieces to determine the placement. We're going to grab our S7 A-frame piece. So this is our upper horizontal, and we're just going to index this in with the little circular index at the forward edge into S1. You want all of your pieces to be shifted forward or into the center, so into that S1 piece. We'll clamp S7 in place, and then we'll use that as a guide to butt S2 up to the index on the aft part of that piece. Again, your clamps are going to be super helpful here so that you can get your horizontals in place and then kind of shift your verticals as needed without having any permanent attachment points mounted. On your S8 piece, there's not really enough clearance for a clamp here, so you can use painter's tape, or if you have a second set of hands, or you can go ahead and secure that forward set screw hole to hold the forward edge, and then you can kind of manipulate the backside with that S2 piece. When you have your S8 piece where you want it, you can use that as an index for S2 and secure it in place with your set screws again. But you want your S2 to be nice and flush with that index on S8, and that's going to get you your bottom placement for that vertical piece. S5 and S6 are going to be your forward horizontal pieces. For these pieces, you're still going to branch off of your S1 piece, but you don't have a forward vertical to determine your height of the forward edge. For S6, you're going to use, there's a horizontal seam that goes along that lower rib. So you're just going to line it up with that line in the van. And you can, again, use tape or magnets here to hold it in place, or if you have a second set of hands. And then you can secure it in place with set screws on either end. For S5, your upper horizontal, you don't have a seam or anything to line up like you do with S6. So there's a factory hole on the forward side of that horizontal rib, which is kind of right above where your B pillar would live. We're going to go ahead and drill that out with a 25/64 bit. And then we're going to use this as our indexing point to get our placement of that forward edge of S5. There's a pre-drilled kind of elongated hole in your A-frame that's going to line up with that factory hole. Again, you're going to shift everything back towards S1, and then that elongated hole lets you have a little bit of play, like forward and back, depending on your specific van. After you've got your placement set with that indexing point using that factory hole, you can go ahead and clamp this piece in place and then set your set screws like you've done with the rest of the pieces up until now. When I set my set screw for my S5 piece, it drifted a little bit, which made my S5 index in not quite as snugly as I wanted it to. So I went ahead and took it out and then re-secured the piece in place with both some clamps and some tape just to make sure that it didn't go anywhere. And then I went ahead and re-drilled my set screw hole just in a slightly lower location so that I could get a better attachment point and it fit nice and snug like I wanted to. This is a big benefit of getting all the pieces in place first with set screws because you can shift things if needed and get them exactly where you want without anything being permanent. Once you have one side's A-frame all the way installed with the set screws, go ahead and check all of your indexing points and make sure that they're nice and flush. If you have any gapping or overlapping, you're going to want to reset them. Again, you can reset set screw holes if you need, use clamps, anything necessary to make sure everything is indexing nicely and sitting nice and flush and branching off of that S1 piece on your zero line. When you're happy with your placement and your index points, you can move on to setting your rivnuts. So all of the larger holes that are pre-drilled in your A-frame are going to be drilled out and have rivnuts set through them. You have a 25/64 bit from your first box that you're using here. It's a little bit shorter of a drill bit, which is great because it keeps you from puncturing the outside of the van. You still want to go slow and be careful and not kind of shoot through, because if you hit the outside sheet metal of the van, you can dimple it. So just be cognizant of that as you're working through. As long as you have your pieces clamped and taped and really securely in place, you can go ahead and drill out all of your holes at once. If you're only using set screws, be really sure that the piece isn't drifting at all. The set screws can kind of wiggle out as you're drilling your holes. So make sure that everything is nice and secure, or you have someone else kind of keeping an eye on things, or like holding the piece in place as you're drilling out your holes. This next part in the process is going to be drilling out all of our attachment points. So for each of these rivnut holes, we're going to drill out the hole, clear out any metal shavings. We typically do this by taking the piece all the way down and clearing off metal shavings from both the back of the A-frame piece and the van wall itself. You can use an air tool for this, a rag, anything. Do be careful. The shards of metal are going to be sharp. So either wear gloves or protect yourself from getting cut with any of those. After you have the metal shavings cleared, you can go ahead and deburr. That gets any kind of metal shavings off the back side of the hole that you drilled. And then we're going to rust prevent. You can deburr either with or without the A-frame piece in place. It doesn't matter. And then rust prevent, you always want to go through your A-frame piece because you likely took off some of that powder coating on the A-frame when you drilled your hole through the sheet metal. When all of your rivnut holes are drilled and treated with your rust prevent, you can go ahead and set your rivnuts. I like to move from the center out when I do this. Again, be careful to notice if the piece is drifting at all. You want to make sure that all of your holes are lining up. Depending on your tool, you might have to adjust the settings. A lot of them are pressure based, so it should kind of auto calibrate to the thickness that you're crushing, but check your tool and make sure that it's set to the correct settings to crush both the A-frame and the sheet metal of the van. When setting your rivnuts, there's a few precautions that you want to take. One is going to be that setting on your tool. Another is you want to be setting your rivnuts straight on. You want the threads to come straight out from the piece. If you are angled at all with your tool, it can cause not only the rivnut to set incorrectly, it could also cause it to set correctly but be at an angle, which will make mounting your track a lot harder later on. Occasionally your rivnuts can set incorrectly or not pull the threads right, or it can crush to the wrong amount, making it either spin or pull through the piece. If any of this happens, usually it's a pretty easy fix. You can just drill out the rivnut and set a new one. If you do need to do this, you want to make sure that you go through the same steps of deburring and rust preventing. And when you're drilling out, just go slow and be careful about it. You don't want to blow out the hole in the A-frame so that you can still set another rivnut in its place. One thing to keep in mind is when setting the verticals, the van does curve up a little bit, so make sure to either use a clamp or some pressure on the piece so that when you're drilling out your holes, the A-frame piece is flush with the sheet metal of the van. At the top of your S2 piece, there's going to be a pre-drilled hole in your A-frame piece. This is going to have, usually the van will have a little bit of sheet metal kind of overlapping behind the piece. You want to drill that out, but you don't want to set your rivnut here yet. We're going to set a rivnut through this piece and capture another piece of A-frame later on in the video. After you've drilled out all of the larger holes in the A-frame and set your rivnuts, we're going to move on to our 3/16 rivets. So there's a number of smaller pre-drilled holes in your A-frame. These are going to be for your 3/16 rivets. Take care to notice that a lot of your set screw holes are not going to be replaced by rivets. So a good kind of rule of thumb is if you have any of those smaller holes in the A-frame that are in line with your rivnuts or where track is going to be, you don't want to set a rivet there. It's going to cause your track to not sit flush with the A-frame. But all the other holes that you see are going to get drilled out with that 3/16 and then have a rivet set. Because these holes are so small, you don't need to deburr here. We'll just basically put some rust prevent in the hole and then set our rivet right away. We find that just dipping the rivet in the rust prevent's an easy way to do this. You don't need to use the brush or anything. You can get some kind of drippage, just wipe that away after you have your rivet set. Your aft vertical pieces, so your S2 and the S4, which we'll move on to later on, are going to have these little tabs that go kind of into the window bay. These are going to be the trickiest rivets to set, so you might need to use like a rubber mallet or some pliers or something to get it a little bit closer to the metal. Not a huge deal if you can't get a rivet set here. It's not a structural piece at all. It just kind of helps hold it tight to the van body. Again, not a big deal if you can't. Just move on to the rest of your attachment points. When you have all of your rivets set, you can remove your set screws. Again, we don't want to replace most of these with rivets because they're in line with track, but we are going to treat them with rust prevent since they are an exposed metal hole in the van. The final piece on your driver's side are going to be your wire chase pieces. This is S11 and S12. These are going to index in with the top of your verticals. So again, you're going to kind of start at your zero line, your center point, and there's this kind of stepped index that's going to line up with your S1. At the back side, you're going to have an elongated hole in your S12 piece. So we're going to slip that actually behind your S2. And then that the S12 is going to index in with that hole that we drilled out in S2 earlier. And you're going to use a rivnut to connect them. Besides that back connection point, rivnut that indexes in with S2, the rest of the attachments for this S12 wire chase piece are all your 3/16 rivets. So you can go ahead and set all of the pre-drilled holes in this piece with a 3/16 rivet. Your S11 is going to be your forward wire chase piece. This is the only piece of A-frame that you're going to need to measure for. So you want to get it in place with some clamps, again indexing in with S1. And then you're going to want to measure the distance between your S11 piece and your S5 piece, that upper horizontal. And then you're going to want to go to the forward edge and then repeat that measurement up front. So you just want to make it consistent all the way down. It should be around 10 inches. A lot of times it's about 9 15/16. Measure this a few times. Better to get your measurement right before drilling your holes than have to go back. So we go back and forth quite a few times here. You can see that even in this forward section, I get caught on the clamp there. So be careful that you're paying attention to that and you're measuring nice and flush to your S11 piece down to your S5. After you have your placement set, I like to use a number of clamps to make sure it doesn't move on me at all as I'm drilling out my rivet holes. But once you're nice and secure, go ahead and set all of the rivets in that piece. You can measure as you go just in case you have any drifting. When you have all of your rivets set, you're going to have one riv nut hole at the forward edge of this piece as well. After all of your rivets are set in this piece, you're going to have a riv nut hole at the forward and the back edge of your S11. We're going to move on to our passenger side of the van. So the forward vertical is going to be your S3 piece. Again, this is going to be the kind of piece that we're going to index off of for all of the other A-frame pieces on this passenger side. It's going to have another plastic insert, just like your driver's side, that's going to go into that factory hole on that upper horizontal. And then the rest of the piece is just going to butt up to the kind of bump out in the van right behind the slider door. This is going to give you your vertical placement, or your side-to-side placement rather. And then again, it's following that same zero line, but that zero line turns into that like bump out in the van body. You can use a set screw to secure the bottom portion of this S3 piece. Just be sure to keep pressure so that it's nice and flush to the forward edge of that van body. When S3 is set in place, we're going to grab our passenger side horizontals, so S9 and 10. We're going to go ahead and set these in place with some painter's tape. This is a little bit different of a technique than we did on the driver's side where we set both the horizontals first. Either way is totally fine. This way we can just, the tape, since it's easily removable and easily shifted, we like to just get them up in place here so we can get the placement of S4 a little quicker. When you have your S9 and 10 taped in place, we're going to grab our S4. This is our last piece of kind of wall A-frame that we're going to put in. It has another of those plastic indexing points that's going to go into a factory hole. So we're going to use that to pop it into place. This A-frame piece can be pretty tight with that index, so you might have to give it some love to get it all the way flush with the body of the van. You can use the same technique that we did on the driver's side of securing everything in place with set screws, get it exactly where you want it, make sure your indexes are nice and flush, and then move on to drilling all of your riv nut holes and setting those as well as your rivets at the very end. The last piece of A-frame we have to put in is our S13, so our wire chase on this passenger side. This S13 piece is going to index in really similar to how S12 did on the passengers or on the driver's side. The forward edge is going to index in with S3, and then the back edge is going to slip behind S4, and it has the same style elongated hole that's going to line up with the hole pre-drilled in your S4 piece. You can see here you might have to move your S13 up or down to get those holes to align nicely. The S13 actually slips between the sheet metal of the van and S4. So if you have any gapping between S13 and S4, that might be your problem. You can just shift S13 back forward and then back to make sure it's between the sheet metal and the A-frame piece. After you're all lined up, you can go ahead and set a riv nut here to connect your S13 and your S4, and then move on to setting your rivets in the rest of the piece. After your S13 is set, you're done with your A-frame, so you're complete with your main structure of the van. The next step is going to be our ceiling bracers. This is going to be how your ceiling track is going to attach. So you'll want to get all the supplies you'll need for that, and we can move on to the next step of the install.